Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's AI seminar. Please be advised this seminar is being recorded for Amy's YouTube channel. Please turn off your cameras if you'd prefer and have your microphone muted unless you have a question. You can also feel free to use the chat box. The title of today's seminar, Brain plus NLP greater than NLP, towards the incorporation of human brain data into natural language processing. Our presenter today is Alex Murphy. Alex has recently completed his PhD at the University of Birmingham in cognitive neuroscience and NLP. His interests span many varied topics across neurolinguistics, cognitive neuroscience, machine learning, and natural processing. He holds a bachelor's degree in linguistics alongside master's degrees in language technology and IT and cognition. During his PhD, he was a technical intern on the language team at Google Brain in London, where he worked on analyzing brain data with state-of-the-art deep learning models. He is interested in how human neural data can be incorporated into natural language processing applications and more widely in other domains of artificial intelligence. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just share the screen. Is this visible?
Yeah, it looks good.
Yep, great. Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I'm happy to be able to share some of the things I've been working on over the past few years. I'd prefer general questions at the end of the presentation, but if there's something unclear that makes things hard to follow, please just interrupt and I'll be happy to explain. So first, I'm going to set up the background ideas that are important to understand what I'll talk about, and then I'll zoom in right on a specific set of steps that I've taken during my PhD to help move in that right direction. And then I'll zoom back out again and try to link it all together, looking ahead at what I believe needs to happen next for the field. So we begin with a visual demonstration. I'd like you to imagine that you are a basic object detection system who needs to respond to queries about images by analyzing their contents. So how long do you think it would take you to identify every type of fruit in this bowl? Where are the bananas? How certain are you that there is a plum in this fruit bowl? Color helps. So what about identifying the contents of this bowl? I think it's a hummus. Is it delicious mashed potato? No, it's guacamole. So it's really easy to appreciate how much easier the task is when you have access to an extra feature dimension, namely color. So having access to basic shape and grayscale information is informative, but there really is a boost that when you add in an extra feature dimension of color in this case. Excuse me. So just as you saw the same boost in task performance by adding color, imagine now adding in a feature dimension that's derived from brain signals. So in a nutshell, that's the underlying metaphor that I want to express today, that we can make the next generation of machine learning models better by giving them access to another feature dimension. So that's necessarily not going to be an easy task. I'm not sure about it, but it does look promising. There's still plenty of challenges to solve, but the number of people working on this general idea is rapidly increasing. So this year, Meta AI launched the Brain and Language Lab in Paris, where they're focusing on exploring brain data and language models. And this year was also the first time I've seen explicit references to skills in working with neurolinguistic data for research roles in the tech industry. So this rightmost text is from an ad for research scientists at DeepMind on the language team. And what this goes to show is that while people have been making inroads in this field for quite some years now in academia, the huge unexplored potential and exciting early research is starting to attract a lot of attention across the board, and it's an exciting time to get into the field. But first, why? So while we're seeing a whole host of new models that seem ever more impressive, a lot of issues still plague the ML community in terms of things like covariate shift, adversarial attacks, general lack of robustness. In NLP, for example, covariate shift is a big problem because once trained and deployed, models can suffer a lot if they come into contact with new slang, new jargon, new writing conventions. In computer vision, I think we all have some awareness of the pernicious nature of adversarial attacks, which highlights the lack of model robustness and just how brittle they can be at some points. So many methods being developed to target these flaws, but conceptually, I think they feel quite hacky at times. And recent research has shown that code training on brain signals can ameliorate these problems to some extent. And after all, many common machine learning tasks are often related to challenges the brain has already found solutions for and uses every day. So it makes sense to take advantage of this as we strive to advance the field of AI. And how our models learn or don't learn is very often compared to how we learn as humans. So why not try and make that link explicit? I'm going to spend a few slides highlighting the scientific background that underlies this whole research paradigm that makes us think that any of this is possible. Now, I know that Amy has a broad audience across many domains, so I especially think it would be helpful for them just to set the scene a little bit so that everyone can follow along as a bit better. So, a major result published in Jim Haxby's lab just over 20 years ago now was that his team took fMRI data of people who were viewing objects and images, and then the researchers used a correlation-based classifier to learn a model to predict the identity of the objects being viewed just by using the brain images alone. This was really the start of the age of brain decoding. Then Tom Mitchell's group then discovered that if you can take a bunch of common words and present them to subjects in an fMRI scanner, record the brain responses, calculate the co-occurrence of those words with a small set of action verbs in a trillion-word corpus, resulting in what we could call a primitive form of word vectors, and then learn to predict new fMRI data based on the mapping of these primitive word vectors that were close to the test images not used in the model training. So first in vision, now in language, it's clear that the data that we can record from brains can be reliably related to our stimuli across many different modalities. So around 2014, Jim DiCarlo's lab demonstrated that you can train deep networks to predict objects in various rotations and orientations. And amazingly, they discovered that after training on the images alone, and just to repeat, there's no brain data being used here, some of the representations in the layers of the neural network could explain up to 50% of the variance in the monkey's brain recordings, showing for the first time that something about the structure of neural networks had similar processing strategies highlighted here. So first, we know that the brain contains decodable or encodable representations of stimuli that machine learning classifiers can learn. Secondly, neural networks, when trained on images, naturally learn representations that correlate to brain data. So that this means that the representations, in some sense, must be overlapping somewhat, and training on dual input streams could be a beneficial way forwards. Back in 2016, Nature spotlighted some of this encoding work done by Alex Huth, who created a meaning map across the brain, showing the areas that were responsive to various semantic characteristics. I'll just put that in the background. Yeah, and this was consistent across multiple people that they after they listened to large sections of language. So this was very recent when I started my PhD, and there was a lot of excitement. We moved from a small list of nouns back in 2008 to projecting the whole vocabulary across the entire cortex. And this was just slightly before large language models came onto the scene. So this work by Jack Gallant showed that it was possible to partially reconstruct the video clips from the brain data recorded while people have been watching those same clips. So here in this video, so on the left you have the presented stimuli at the top of the images, and then the edge maps in the bottom part. And on the right are the image reconstructions. And so what this shows is that the neural data contains overlapping representations of the same stimuli, which shouldn't really come as a surprise, as it's well understood in vision science that the retina is isomorphic to the pixels of an image being viewed, and this information is relatively faithfully sent to the back of the head in the visual cortex to be processed. So just in more simple terms, if you see basic shapes on a screen, that quite literally maps to your visual cortex where it can be decoded. So the last idea I want to mention here is more to the key point, adding in brain data to neural network models in order to boost object recognition using data acquired from monkeys in a publicly available data set. So these authors were some from the University of Alberta and Amy had shown that if you give an object recognition model an extra task to preserve the representational distance found between the stimuli in brain data, you can train a better model that makes better mistakes, where the misclassifications were often part of the same conceptual domain. And this was resulting in models that were more robust to label corruption and also perform better at the main task as well by having access to this data. So this work was then later expanded upon by researchers in Tübingen, Germany, where they replaced the secondary objective to be, instead of respecting the pairwise representational structure between the neural networks, it was actually to force the model to predict the brain responses directly, thereby forcing the weights to become more brain-like. Their goal was to determine model robustness after being co-trained both on brain data and images, but tested on corrupted and distorted images. And here are some examples of the corrupted images that the models were tested on with various types of, various categories of image distortions. So, and here in this plot, we have the black line here, which represents the standard model trained to predict clean images. And the main model of interest is the NPL monkey model here in red, where the monkey brain data had been added in as an extra objective to predict. There were control experiments were done with monkey brain data that had been shuffled, as well as comparisons to models that had been explicitly trained on the noisy images. So the shuffling aspect is important because one of the known results of multitask learning is that training is less likely to get stuck in local minima if there are multiple objectives. So you need a control experiment that includes an extra objective to be to model, but doesn't actually use the data that we expect to correlate to the task. And so we can get this by randomly shuffling the data. So the cool result here is the model with access to brain data performed better and was more robust to image distortions, just like one of the control models that had been explicitly trained on the distorted images. But this brain data model didn't see the corrupted images as part of training, but it was as robust to the image corruptions as models that had also been trained on the corrupted images. And this shows that the robustness emerges through the fact that the weights were made to be more brain-like. And they also showed in saliency maps that the models were more interested in the central contents of the image and less about the background and the other image features compared to models that didn't have access to the brain data. So the other multitasking model with the shuffled brain data is the one given in pink in here. And it shows that it never even performed as well as the baseline. And that was fairly conclusive evidence that it was the information in the neural data that was driving this effect. So traditionally, deep neural networks, they accept input in the forms of text, documents, images, speech. And when we've got recorded brain responses to the same stimuli, it can be thought of as containing two types of information. So one type, as I mentioned earlier, contains alternative representations to the same stimuli, typically from the low-level perceptual processing. And this can be used by neural networks to create a more robust model of the input data. And the other type of information is what I'll call complementary, which reflects our brain's processing of the stimuli. And this information, if we manage to model it successfully, it would allow a neural network to be better at the task by having access to additional information over and above what it can get from the traditional inputs. One example of this from neurolinguistics is the garden path sentences. So these are sentences that are introduced in a way to lead you down the garden path and lead you to an expectation, but then the structure is slightly different and you realize you have to reanalyze the whole sentence to make sense of it. And for these types of sentences, the brain generates a strong response. And in theory, if this were modeled jointly with the text, it would be a good signal that something else is going on in the data. Another example from vision that I want to mention is if you measure EEG from a person who processes a face, there's a reliable signal that the brain gives out called the N170 component, which basically means that approximately 170 milliseconds after viewing a face, the brain rings a little bell that tells us that it's just processed a face. But the N170 is also detected when we see faces in everyday objects. So this is known as pareidolia, and convolutional neural networks have been shown to have some sensitivity to this effect, but it's not clear how reliable this is, and the effect isn't that big. So thinking hypothetically again, if you co-train the neural network on images and brain signals, an association between regular faces and the N170 would be learned. And when these face-like images are entered into the network, if an N170 is generated in the brain, this would interact with the model weights to give an extra signal that's not present in the original image. If you're interested, there's a great TEDx Calgary talk about neural networks and pareidolia by Brianna Brownell, available on YouTube. And so here's an example closer to home to you in Alberta. Someone found online a few years ago in Google Earth. So what I want to explain here is that this demonstrates there are two streams of information that neural networks could take advantage of. One is the lower level perceptual information that's an alternative representation of the original stimuli, the actual picture or image of a face, while the other is a brain-specific response that's generated after we've performed mental operations on those representations. And so if we present a pareidolia image, the brain would recognize the face, but not the low-level perceptual features. So if we had a CNN model that had been co-trained on brain data and examples of pareidolia, it would trigger a signal which would boost the representation of the face in the neural network. So this is just a fun pedagogical example, mainly because I wanted to show you these funny images. But as our techniques for reading the brain evolve, the opportunities are only going to increase. And as with anything at the cutting edge of science, a lot more research needs to be done. And that leads me to some of the recent work that I've done on decoding linguistic information from EEG signals. So first, what is EEG? For those that aren't aware, the EEG is the recording of electrical brain signals from electrodes that are placed on the scalp. EEG detects the instantaneous electrical activity, which means it has an excellent temporal resolution. But because the skull distorts the electrical signals as they leave the head, it has poor spatial resolution. So we can often only tell in which general area the signals came from, which means that it's a lot less sensitive than the monkey data recorded directly from the surface of the brain that was mentioned previously. So our end goal in this paper was to work with the data directly in the single trials. And we also wanted to explore building separate networks, one for text, one for EEG, and then we would combine the higher level representations in a late fusion style model, as well as doing neural co-training. But because the signal is so noisy in EEG, it's often important to average signals together in order to increase the signal to noise ratio. So here's an example to visualize what I'm talking about. So here we have one example of EEG data when someone read a determiner and also an adverb. And this is just very, very noisy electrical brain signal from all of the 64 electrodes from the moment just before a word was read up until 900 milliseconds afterwards. And the bottom plot is what we call a difference wave. It's plainly just the arithmetic subtraction of the one plot from the other in order to see how they differ at all. So as we average more and more trials together, you can see that the responses themselves in the top two plots become a lot less noisy, and the difference wave only reveals something interesting after averaging a lot of signals together. So this is important when it comes to incorporating the noisy signals into machine learning models, as it can tell you whether your data contains the signal of interest and where you can find it. So if I just randomly partition some data into two classes and repeat the same process that I've done above, you can see that the only thing that remains are the brain's visual responses to reading, which happen regardless of word identity. It's just a component of the reading process. But if you look at the difference wave, as the averages increase, it's flat. It's because there was nothing unique or consistent about the data points in each partition. And that's another important point, that if there's a brain response that's consistent across a class, then you can model that class. And if you hypothesize a division of data and you don't see any response in an average signal, either the brain doesn't emit a unique response or it's too low in its signal quality to be detected. So you need to make sure what you model is what you think you're modeling, which is where the issue of confounds comes in. And language especially is very highly correlated. And often the brain responses that we want to model are correlated with other brain responses that have much stronger signals. So the work I presented at Decoding PoS speech from Human EEG is the paper I presented at ACL this year. And it was framed in the style of a part-of-speech tagging style problem as a first step to incorporating brain data into deep neural networks. That's right. So before you blindly add brain data to language models, it's first important to verify, what can neural networks do with the EEG data directly, and how best can you extract the signals of interest? Because this gives you then your informed sense of what to expect if you later want to merge brain data and other input modalities in this framework. So the paper has three main parts to it. The first is to address the issue of part-of-speech confounds, which I'll explain in a few slides. The second was to look at specialized training methods to model the EEG data with transformers and compare them to baseline SVM models. And the first part was to examine the direct decoding of part-of-speech in the final part, was to look at single words, what we call unigrams, and two-word sequence, what we call bigrams, to better understand what aspects of the signal are being used to solve this task and what could be later utilized in downstream or further NLP tasks in the future. So to illustrate the issue of confounds, when we want to look at decoding part-of-speech, that involves trying to create the partitions of data into classes, like I mentioned before, but it's not so easy because part-of-speech is highly correlated with word length and word frequency. And if you look at some of the part-of-speech here, you can see that many are confounded between length and frequency. Now, this is a problem if the classifier is drowned out by louder signals from the confounds. And also the fact that if there were no part-of-speech signal detectable at all with the EEG, blindly partitioning part-of-speech into these classes would still result in strong above-chance accuracy due to mainly that you're modeling the confounds. And if your goal relies on an ability to model subtle distinctions between part-of-speech to get access to linguistic responses in the brain, this becomes an issue. For example, how would you tell the difference between a determiner or a pronoun if they both have strong signals for being short words and also high frequency? So first, I needed to verify that there is a decodable signal relating to part-of-speech that could not be explained by the confounds of word length and word frequency. So I can characterize this a little bit with an analogy. The brain responses to the low-level characteristics are typically more robust and more easily detectable, while the high-level responses are weaker and harder to detect. As I mentioned earlier, when we see effects to stimuli in the EEG data, it's like the brain is alerting us to something. So it's like hearing a little bell ringing, except with word length and word frequency responses, these are more like air horns. If you're holding your EEG microphone to the brain, the horns make it near impossible to hear any of the smaller bells ringing. So how we approached this problem was I used a subset of the English web tree-bank corpus, which is fully linguistically annotated. And since we wanted to explore the issue of signal averaging, we opted to have a more extensive data set using a single subject who acquired the corpus multiple times. And we were very careful about how we split the data into the training, development, and test sets to completely avoid any chance of data leakage. So the signal averages are used for randomly bootstrapped bit replacement in the training set, so that in theory we can create any training data set size we wanted. But for the test set, obviously we couldn't do that because this then violates the independence assumptions of the statistical tests. And just to clarify about these average signals, all I'm talking about is if you put all the training data into a bucket with compartments for each class, and then you go around the compartments, you can pull out any number of data points belonging to that class, average them together, put the original ones back, and throw this average data into a new training bucket, and you just repeat the process until the new bucket has as many items as the single trial one in the end. And here's a figure depicting the data acquisition process. So the words are read at a fixed rate, 240 milliseconds, and for each word we extract. So if you focus on the word to here, this would be the word that we're taking in this specific trial, and we would take 700 milliseconds afterwards as well. And so the transformer then would accept a tensor batch by channels, by time, while for the SVM we would flatten the representation and the channels by time dimensions, as it requires a two-dimensional input. So because this is very experimental research, we had to be quite conservative about removing confounds from the data by, we did this by creating binary classes that were equally balanced for the confounds. So what this means is that if we aim to model word length, word frequency, and word class, where word length is made up of long words and short words, according to the table, and frequency is made up of high and low frequency words, and word class had an open versus closed class level, which is a natural division among parts of speech. And here I just want to apologize for the overloading of the term class, because in one sense, I'll talk about it in the standard sense in machine learning, but in linguistics, we talk about a binary division between what's called open class and closed class words. And you might have also heard it called the lexical versus grammatical distinction, or function words versus content words. It's just labels for the same idea. So the best way to correct for these confounds that I came up with was to take each of these three dimensions of interest in the binary divisions, and for each of them exactly match each level of the class with regard to the confounds. So for example here, if we were modeling word length, each of the short and the long levels of this, they have exactly the same distribution of word class and word frequency. So any above chance accuracy cannot be to do with these confounds. And this is the same for the open versus closed class words here. So as you can see, because of these distributions are matched, we had to discard a lot of data to do this, and we could only take a subset of the available data. But at the end of the talk, I will refer to some ideas in reinforcement learning about modeling confounds in order to disentangle these feature dimensions a bit better and hopefully be more data efficient. So in the first experiment of this paper, we wanted to show that by how you can partition the data in a way to avoid confounds, you can run a simple model, and here we used a linear SVM, and you can uncover a temporal decoding trace by sliding a small window of data over the EEG responses. So just like illustrated in this video. We would take the data in each window, train on it, assess the model on the corresponding test data, and move to the next window. At the end of this process, we have a series of values, and this then can tell us what is the temporal sensitivity of the model to these binary class distinctions. So for length decoding, this plot at the bottom shows the decoding trace for our single trials, and here for averages of 3, and here for averages of 10. And the top figure is a difference plot between the two classes, similar to what I showed you before in the averages slide. And it shows where in time and what is the distribution of the electrodes where there are large differences between the two classes. And here we have the results of the frequency, which peak a little later than word length, but just as strongly. You see clear off-chance decoding accuracy here with averaging of 3 trials and then for averaging of 10 trials. And the same here for word class. As you can see, for the single trials, there's almost no effect. And it's only when we start to see averages of 3 and averages of 10 that there are more reliable decoding results. And these results are more modest than the word length and word frequency ones, because it's again the distinction between bells versus air horns that you see in the data. The main point is that there is a decodable signal for open versus closed classes after removing the effects of length and frequency, and this has been debated in the literature about whether this confound was explaining all of the results that people found, but people had previously suggested there was syntactic level response detectable in EEG data. So this means that if we're careful about controlling for these confounds in the signal data, and the signal in the data that we want to capture is present, and that we can decode it, and therefore it's a candidate to be added to neural networks in the follow-up work. So these results also show that averaging does boost signals, and through that we can recreate the time courses of what's known about the reading processes in the brain and the trajectories. So after we'd verified all of this and moved on to how to model the EEG data directly, there are a few cool tricks and tweaks to the training paradigm for neural networks, 2 of which are data augmentation and pre-training. This inspired me to experiment with ways to boost the decoding accuracy of the EEG data in the transformer models. So I've already shown how training on average data results in high accuracy. So I explored the effects of augmenting the training data. And after this, I looked at pre-training on those average data points and then fine-tuning to the single trials. For this, I used the same confound corrected data that I described just before. But instead of the 2 classes, I made it a 6-class paradigm where I took 3 parts of speech from the open class, 3 from the closed, and equally balanced them. This again meant that quite a few more data points were put to one side. And throughout, we need to be able to say what is the ability of a transformer, and you need a baseline model. And so I contrast linear support vector machines and transformers a lot in this paper. Linear SVMs have been a common classifier used to decode brain data in the past, and therefore was a good baseline model to compare the transformers with. However, since they're not traditionally trained in the same way, we still have a problem to solve. So transformers are trained by a variance of stochastic gradient descent, while SVMs are trained by solving a constrained optimization problem. And so if we have the three data splits at training, development, and test, it wasn't clear how we could make this fair, since if we were training the SVM only on the train set, it doesn't end up taking advantage of the development set, which is what the transformer does. But then if we clump the development set together with the training set for the SVM, then the SVM gets more varied training data than the transformer, and there's another unfair advantage. However, there's a formulation of the linear SVM using stochastic gradient descent with a hinge loss function, and this allowed us to completely mirror the early stopping, learning rates, batch sizes, the whole training paradigm between both models, and the exact data they use for training and model selection. And for completeness, here's the parameters of the transformer encoder model that's used in this paper. So here are the results when we have the augmented training data, and the figure is split into two. At the top we have the results of the averages of 10, and at the bottom we have the results of the averages of 3. So, I mean, as expected, the more averaging you do, the clearer the signal and the higher the decoding accuracy. And as we move along the x-axis, the size of the training set is increased. From the original 20,000 samples all the way up to 500,000. The red crosses here are the transformer results, and the blue dots are the SVM results. Should also point out here that these results are in the dev set, as we consider this to be a hyperparameter choice. And so after we performed this, we looked at the best training set size here was clearly 250,000. And so using this hyperparameter, we did a statistical test between the scores on the original 20,000 versus the 250,000 on the held out test set, and it was shown to be a significant increase. And I then wanted to explore these ideas of pre-training. Because EEG is so noisy, especially the closer that you are to single trials, I thought, okay, if the networks were primed a bit to recognize a model and model a clear signal that we already had shown lets boosted accuracy scores, then the move from randomly initialized weights in the network to single trial decoding might be easier if it was in a fine-tuning step from a more idealized higher signal representation. So I first looked at pre-training on the highest averages, and then backing off to the lower averages, and finally tuning on the single trials, as well as just starting from the lower average data, the averages of 3. And I looked at this pre-training idea with and without the data augmentation, but only using the best size selected from the first figure and comparing it to training only on noisy trial data. So both methods conveyed statistically significant benefit when assessed on test data, and this 3-1 250K data augmentation was the best result. And this is also confirmed by statistical tests on the test data as well. But one unexpected finding was, if you look back in the first figure, when we have 500,000 samples used in the training, the data augmentation results, why do we see this reduction in accuracy? So what we believe is going on is so each original ratio between the total data set size of your originals and the number of classes, there's a sort of sweet spot that allows for derived averages to be useful in data augmentation. But if the number is too high, then you can introduce too much of a dependence between the average data. So if you were interested in looking at modeling noisy data like EEG with neural networks, then this would be a hyperparameter that you would want to consider. So the final experiment in the paper outlines the performance of actually decoding single trial, one-word unigrams and two-word sequences using SVMs and transformers, and then we compared the performance. So how we did this was by running 2 windowing analyses. So the middle one is similar to the one I explained earlier. It's a sliding window. We take the same window, we analyze on the training, assess the model on the development set, and test on the test set, and then correct multiple comparisons afterwards. The top figure is incremental window. So like the sliding window, we're not shifting it along the data. We're fixing it to the left and we're gradually expanding it. So at each point that you see going from left to right, the model has wider access to temporal data in order to detect which of the 6 parts of speech are being decoded in here. And so for this experiment, we took more of an engineering perspective, and we decided to model the data as it is. So this is using data we didn't correct for confounds. We took the original data and we just split it into parts of speech, because at the end of the day, for part of speech tagger based on EEG, the confounds are useful to some extent, and we'd already established a presence of signal of interest beyond that of word length and frequency, so we know that that's there as well. So there's clear dominance of the transformer model in these results, particularly as the window extends to include a lot of EEG data. The sliding window results are interesting because you see these 2 small bumps here, which we take to be an early response to the low-level information, followed by the later syntactic or semantic signal driven by the part of speech identity. But one trouble we had here is that our windows of EEG, if you remember from before, they encompass multiple words being read. So the timing of these is shown by the vertical lines in the bottom of the plot here. So if the transformer is as great as a cheat as we suspect, then it will exploit every possible hint it can as a way to find a way to model the label distribution. So when we went to look at bigram decoding, we took a bit of a special approach. And so here I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek about calling it cheating, but all I mean is is the transformer picking up on subtle hints that are in the data, possibly due to the confounding influence of the following words? And the answer is very much yes. We could have expanded the unigram analysis straight to a bigram one, but we wouldn't have been able to answer this question. So we chose to carefully craft a bigram data set that was equally balanced both in terms of the number of data points per class, still keeping it a 6-class decoding problem, but like the unigram analysis. But this time we balanced the orders of the parts of speech in each bigram. So this means that if the models are cheating and looking ahead, it's now much harder to cheat, because if the first word is recognized as a noun or the last word is recognized as a noun, there's only a 50% chance of picking the right bigram in each case, and each of these 3 parts of speech appear equally often in each position. So interestingly, we see the transformer advantage drop right the way down to the level of the SVM, and the windows where there is a statistical significance are marked by asterisks. And if you look at the sliding window between these 2 peaks, there's a small window when the data contains the higher level linguistic information from the first word and the lower level word length frequency information from the second word. And only in that case, we concluded that the transformer does a little bit better by successfully incorporating these different signal types. But another explanation for this drop in accuracy is the fact that in order to have this equal balancing, we had to reduce the data set size quite drastically. So the transformers usually work on vast amounts of data on larger data sets. So it's clear to us that this could have been an effect, but also the fact that the transformer is definitely picking up in confounds on the data, and if you use a transformer on anything that's correlated, the transformer will absolutely pick up on this. And if your goal is more like engineering focused, it isn't so much of a problem, but if you want to make neuroscientific conclusions, this requires great care and attention. And that was the crux of the ACL paper, and I just want to bring it back a bit and bring it back to this figure from earlier and explain how does these results fit in with what I was talking about before. But so broadly speaking, the multiple brain responses to linguistic stimuli can be categorized in terms of the low-level responses and high-level responses. And word length responses are low-level responses, as are frequency, because the visual cortex will progressively decipher the ever-increasing receptive fields of graphemes, and the system that is responding to word length feeds directly into the system that recognizes common patterns, which is very sensitive to frequency effects. Syntax and semantics are more high-level responses, and in other terms, the neural networks can very easily extract their own representations of length directly from the input, which again is another reason to treat this as what I would call an alternative representation. The character count in the text input, and the visual cortex signals represent the same thing in different representational spaces. But this isn't the case for high-level linguistic responses, which only come from the brain. And I have some upcoming work that looks at the structure of misclassifications and NLP prediction tasks after incorporating brain data, and does appear to be a parallel in the fact that the mistakes are more conceptually explainable after various co-training on some BERT models. That work's not quite ready yet, so watch the space for that. So what I wanted to end with was a glance at a few future directions of where I think the field needs to go in order to make some solid progress in this direction. So first of all, brain data is nearly always confounded, and it's not desirable to discard so much data just to balance the confounds in the way that I described before. I think because it hadn't been done before, we had no way to think whatever we had tried, this is the only way to absolutely be sure that there are no confounds and it can't be explained. And this can be then used as a way to test whether other ways perform as well as this while actually making use of more data. And so I think there are interesting ideas in reinforcement learning, connected to representation learning, that could help, provide a path forward to some sample-efficient methods to model the multiple dimensions of these confounds. So one recent piece of work was done with scholars at the University of Alberta, where the goal was to explicitly model inputs at multiple levels, a primary and a secondary one, which provided useful information in a sequence labeling task by predicting the upcoming information and incorporating this during decoding. So what it was doing was predicting part of speech of the next word in a language modeling task. And you can, by doing this and providing this representation, you dramatically constrain the search space of what your choices are for the next prediction. And you can also derive the uncertainty estimates from these action values, where the actions map over the levels of a class of secondary information. So my idea would be that expanding action space to account for secondary effects in terms of confounds, if these can be factored into the modeling problem and potentially accounted for. And so given the brain data is limited in these ideas of sample efficient and also estimate the future predicted reward, it seems like a very promising approach for sequence-based tasks. And the brain is also a fantastic predictor of upcoming information. You have theories in neuroscience like predictive coding, which states that the brain is constantly generating and updating a mental model of its environment. That fits very well with the ideas in RL. So one way to, you could approach this is by sharing a vector space in which directions represented confounded information that could be then subtracted away to reveal the lower magnitude information elsewhere. So I imagine this idea from word vectors is familiar to most of you, and conceptually it's a simple extension in the context of what I've been talking about. So being able to remove a meaningful dimension as such could translate over into NLP, or even just in a more general setting. If you model the confounds of secondary information and derive representations in a similar vector space, and you can correct for the confounds potentially, and then use those representations to have access to what would be a lower signal response in brain, what I would call more the high level information. Another direction is with multimodal models, which is an extremely exciting development that hasn't been driven by the need to connect brain data in any way, but mapping neural network representations to vision-only models and language-only models, as well as seeing the mapping from brain data to multimodal language models. It gives us an unprecedented insight into how to tease apart the neural network representations that are at the conceptual level and not strictly tied to specific modalities, making them task agnostic, or what we could call conceptually general. And knowing how to identify these in neural networks means that there are good targets to be co-trained with the same general representations found in brain data. So Alana Fish showed a few years ago that convolutional neural networks have overlapping representations with word vectors just by virtue of modeling the same external entities in the real world. And this was a discovery driven by applying brain decoding techniques to traditional data types. And so now we have access to models that share multiple levels of diverse representations. And if we use the neural co-training to specifically target, say, lower level layers with lower perceptual brain data and vice versa, we have control over averaging the brain responses to promote certain aspects of the signal. And what this means is we can really crack open the inner workings and get access to the model internals and make a lot of tweaks depending on our task goals. And the human perceptual system, is linked to how we know neural networks learn. So basic shape extraction in lower levels, higher level concepts in higher layers, there's a clear consistency and mirroring here. And so this figure is just an aid to clarify what I was just talking about there, that neural network layers extract basic level information from stimuli, as does the brain. And so we can apply neural co-training here. And the same for the higher level information, but we're not limited in the data we use as a target. And by disentangling these representations or by averaging data points of a specific class, we can tune the representational context that the neural network is forced to predict, and thereby constrain the representations to obey what the brain does in its responses across various parts of the brain. So we could take something to the back of the brain, so you must only predict from the visual cortex or from the high level area, and this would influence what the model would pay attention to. So here is a figure from a recent paper where the authors visually demonstrate the mapping from various models into brain data. So in blue we have a convolutional neural network that was trained on input text but as pixelated images, while in green we have the Word2Vec-like embeddings, like non-contextual, and in red are the correspondence found in contextual transformer models. The colours describe where there are strong correlations in the brain data from fMRI and MEG, which is the magnetic equivalent of EEG. And so it's probably worth just stating it again, that the machine learning models here have never seen brain data. So these correlations are all coming from the naturally learned representations. And I think now that we need to start thinking about how to use this data for better neural networks, it's clear from work like this that there's a wealth of information waiting to be used, and bottleneck is really the limited expertise in people being able to apply these techniques. So what I want to end with is, if you're a student at the moment or looking for a change in research direction, I highly encourage you to get involved. And yeah, some of the work I didn't get to talk about today just isn't quite ready just yet. It's on how the various pre-processing of EEG signals has a dramatic effect on task-dependent processes, particularly to do with what's typically done in EEG, where you remove the eye movements, but the eye movements are correlated with linguistic features, and so you can remove too much of a representation that's actually beneficial for you if you model it correctly. And yeah, other work that I mentioned before on the neural co-training with BERT models. But all in all, there's a lot to be discovered, and the future is very exciting for the joint field of cognitive neuroscience and machine learning. And if you do work with models that struggle with tasks that the brain already knows how to do, perhaps think about applying some of these techniques. And if you reach out to me, I'd be happy to discuss further and maybe point you in an interesting direction. And so just want to say thank you very much, and also credit to my supervisors, Uta Noppany and Brent Bonat, who have been extremely helpful throughout my PhD.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions that they would like to pose?
I guess I could break the ice. So this has been a great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And of course, this is very related to my work. And one thing I think about a lot is what is the niche? Like, where is the place where brain data can really help? Because brain data is expensive, both in actual cost and actual time. So if we could do it without brain data, that probably will always be better. So where is that niche where brain data is important and can really be useful?
It's a great point. So some of the things that with the early representations about forcing co-training with representation, respecting the representational structure of the data, you could always define this by humans or other models that are to do with how similar things in a hierarchical tree or something. It doesn't have to be the brain response in a certain way. In terms of what I presented in terms of the alternative representations of data and the complementary ones, it's the complementary ones that aren't just alternative, robust making data sources for neural networks. It's clearly that the side of once the brain would say ring one of these little bells or give you an indication that something's gone on that's really, really impossible to get from the inputs, that is the crucial aspect that interests me most. So, for example, in dependency parsing, we always have this example of prepositional phrase attachment, and how exactly to create this structure. And the brain could have signals in different ways. It's doing it statistically as it's been done. It gets a bit better, but there are always going to be these issues there, and we know that the brain manages to do this without fail nearly all of the time. Attacking the fact that there's something here. If we could completely model the thematic structure of the subjects, the objects, and the dependency relations, and figure out how to get this, that could completely solve that problem. And that's the true idea of where the brain data would be absolutely essential. In the other ways with the robust things, you can make your own noisy images, you can train on them, as has been done as well. This idea of robustness can be found in other ways. It's just that as it's in itself kind of comes along as an extra prize. If you're modeling with brain data and you can split up these representations, you also get robustness, but you primarily are after the access to the information that isn't present at all in the signal or detectable via the traditional methods of training neural networks.
I have a question.
Hi, yes.
Actually, I have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll just start with this one. Sort of starting along with Alon is, what are some of the end goals? I feel like maybe I've actually asked Alon this question before, but is one of the main goals to make neural network training better by incorporating brain data, or is it to also make neural networks more brain-like and then help us make those a better modeling tool to actually understand the brain as well?
So anyone who's in this field will always say the same thing, that there's this bidirectional arrow between both, because you can't make a discovery with one without learning something about the other. So in a case of which direction does this arrow go, I think you'll always find in terms of like the Meta AI press release when they set up the brain and language model, it's all in terms of, and also in the DeepMind, the job advert as well, you'll see that they'll say that we want to make neural networks better by having access to the brain to train in a more human-like way and have access to this information. But if you do find out that, something to do with the stimuli and the input is happening in this specific place at this specific time in the brain, neuroscientists or neurolinguists are very, very interested in this, because that's not something that you could really figure out before. And so you can't really progress drastically in one field without having a whole new set of questions open up in the other one as well. So the end goal is very much both in that sense. You couldn't really pick one or the other. Obviously you can choose to focus on one and then you would generate hypotheses for somebody else to investigate later on as well. What I see the main benefit is trying to get past a lot of these problems that we still face in terms of lack of robustness, and there's the same issues that constantly crop up with difficult sentences in terms of how you process them linguistically in a model as well. It's just because that drastically at very, very fast speeds the brain will do something and you still can't. You still fail at some very simple hurdles, and trying to figure out how. I don't think the idea of bigger models with more data would essentially break through that wall is there, and this is an avenue that I obviously can't say whether it would work, but I think it has the potential to, especially as recording modalities get cheaper, they get more precise, and we're able to to target brain representations and track what's going on when people do various things in more of a fine-grained detail. Does that answer?
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, that's great. Okay. And in fact, that was actually my preemptive question to ask my second one. So if there is this bidirectional arrow, there is take something of like standard neural networks and either add regularizers. What about throwing them all in the garbage and saying, these just couldn't be correct. Let's make totally different activation functions, or like really rethink the structure of these. Is that ever something you think about?
It's kind of like what I would just call the forbidden question. It's like it's on everybody's mind, but does anyone really want to commit to that thing? I think that absolutely. I think anyone who's thought for any great length of time about this. Okay, sometimes when you see these DALI 2 models and these great diffusion models that come about, it's very easy to get, we're on the right track now, and then Gary Marcus will come along and blast a hole in what's been carefully cherry picked, and you'll find out that he was still just suffering from it. It's the same problem, just dressed up in a new way as well. I think that what that other replacement will be, because I mean it won't be this as well. This is kind of a way for us to get the pieces of knowledge, and kind of, you know, each paper that's published is like a jigsaw puzzle, and we throw that into a giant pot, and then, you know, eventually we're building towards something where we can shape together a corner, take the corner pieces, and gradually build up, you know, the solution to the final jigsaw puzzle. But exactly what that final picture will look like to complete the jigsaw puzzle, I'm not sure what it is. But, you know, in terms of varying more of the activation functions, I think that in terms of doing machine learning on brain data, you sort of, you know, you're hanging by the side of the train of the normal AI community here. It's, you know, when large language models come in, they're so dominant as well, it's very, very difficult to kind of set up and follow and, you know, be published in the same conferences if you're sort of not hanging onto that train, and, you know, we know what you're doing over here, we found a way to relate it to here as well, and this is where the funding comes in. So there's so many other different questions to think about, and a lot of it's, you know, careers are on the line, and reputations and things like that. But I would always respect someone who has the willingness to seriously investigate alternatives, and especially as it could be in terms of what's going on. But I always think that, you know, the end goal is to model what the brain already does. So the closer we move in that direction always feels like the right step.
Anyone have anything further to add? Comments, questions?
I heard from Lily on Slack that there might be a question from the room he's in, but the mic's not working. Do you guys want to ask via chat?
Whilst they're asking, I have one more question too as a follow-up. I mean, of course, all the sciences like that. We're all working on the wrong thing right now because it's impossible that we're at the answers. You're right. We're all building up. So obviously, I feel the same way. Why am I building on these algorithms that I know are going to be incorrect in 10 years? But in any case, what about, there are some models that are being used, like, for example, really big sparse neural networks are starting to become a thing. And, you know, maybe that's a bit more brain-like. Have people looked at those when it comes to saying modeling language and using really big sparsely connected neural networks and seeing if that has relationships to brain data?
I haven't come across research in that area of using brain data modeling and sparse neural networks, but I'm, you know, familiar with the ideas of sparse neural networks and what it could be used for. I think that there's a lot of ways that could be interesting. It's difficult to kind of put an idea together on the spot, but so the answer is that there's nothing that I'm aware of. I believe a lot of it is tied to, you know, let's build a representation, let's link, you know, the brains to the current models. And, you know, this has been going on. The fact that, you know, information correlates to this, and we can show some fancy pictures, it seems to be going on year by year now. This is why I want to take the data and actually make the neural networks better, and not just show that we have new correspondences and new areas that light up, and here's you know, another figure that we can show. It's perhaps, you know, tied into the last question that you mentioned about different types of models, something to do with you know, connecting to sparse ones, especially as, you know, as it would relate to the confounding question, and, you know, how to, you know, potentially model these and reduce the confounds and, you know, split things up. You know, the whole sparse idea is very relevant area in that domain, and it's quite, yeah, something to think about.
Okay, thanks.
I have one more sort of technical question that I'd like to ask. I really like the idea of modeling confounds as a secondary prediction problem. But I wonder, like, what will be the thing that allows you to tease apart a confound from a signal? Like,
so the way I could think about it in my mind would be, you would have to, you know, predefine what you expect the confounds to be, and therefore you create, say, average representations or do something else, and you would be able to, like in the example of the vector space model of the king and the queen and thing, you would take a lot of things that are in this data, you would find something that unites them all, and their whole, you know, what connects them and what's shared among them would be what you expect to be that direction in the space, and just try to subtract away from that. And, you know, by having, you know, this kind of, let's say, vector space, a model of different feature dimensions, or what's length, what's a part of speech tag, or things like this. That's the way that instantly comes to mind. But I'm sure there are more clever ways to do it as well. But yeah, modeling them as secondary confounds it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. That seems to be, let's say, the answer that jumps to mind most easily, I'd say. But there's like you, I think it's such an interesting thing, and it's absolutely necessary in terms of some of the papers that I've seen on arXiv to do with adding brain data into these models. Now there's clearly not a lot of attention to them, and it is a bit worrying that some of these things might not be challenged as much, because if you're not taking confounds into account, I've seen written conclusions that I just know are not true, but because that hasn't been assessed, and that's kind of a dangerous area when people have access to open data sets, and they can just model the labels as they want and come up with a lot of post hoc explanations to the data. And if that leads us down the wrong path, and people try to replicate it, it's a crisis. It's very important to take confounds very, very seriously, especially in language as well. Also vision, and an image is not made up of one sole thing unless it's a specially prepared image. It's if you have a picture of a horse as well, it's also a picture of grass, it's also a picture of a fence or a farmhouse in the background. There's so much going on.
Good. And confounds are things that are shared but you're not interested in. And have you thought also about maybe the same framework for individual differences? So things that are not shared amongst different data points, but you would also like to model out?
Do you have an example?
Well, let's say I have a whole bunch of people who grew up in England, learning that English, and then people who grew up in Canada. Mm-hmm. And there's differences in our language, but there's also just differences in our experience. And, so some of those could come out in, but it also makes me think of some of the work that Russ Greiner has done with trying to model the batch effects, or the site effects that come from recording MRI in different locations. Just have different signals from different machines. You can do a very good job of classifying the site at which the thing was recorded, but that's not what you're actually interested in. Yeah. Nor is it really a confound, right? It's not, because it exists only in subsets of the data.
I think if there's a more principled method of dealing with confounds that's less kind of ad hoc, I think everything that I've talked about is being sort of, okay, we have this, how do we do this? It's a bit of a hacky thing. I'd love to see a principled, set of ideas and methods that are to classify them in a more formal direction, and in terms of, like you say, that if you look at things that aren't shared, say, also going back to the vector space model, what's in the opposite direction, what exists orthogonal to this, and what do you never see together, and you have a good metric for space, and you can quantify things, what's in the local area, what's further away, how consistent is that? That's one way I think about that. But in absence of a more well-defined paradigm for confound modeling, it's hard to say what it could be. There are so many different ways, and how you could ever be confident that they truly were what you expected, I'm not too sure about, but very interesting question.
There's a question in the chat. I'm happy to read for you if you'd like, or do you have access to see it?
Objectively worse, just or subsequent illusions can survive as soon as they humans have problems with. Okay, I'll just read out the question.
Great.
Are you aware of any places where code training with a brain-related objective may lead to objectively worse results? Optical illusions come to mind as something humans have problems with that may not want to carry over to models. That is a fantastic question. I have never thought about that, but that certainly seems to be something that I imagine people have probably found it in the the file draw problem, and it's never been published because you only want to show benefits as well. But that's the interesting thing about some of this is why is it sometimes what doesn't work as well, what show the opposite result. So if you have an optical illusion, you're tricked, or there are plenty of situations where machines do things better than humans, and I'm trying to think of an example. We have this blind spot in the back of our head, and in our vision, and many other things. An optical illusion would come to mind. No, I just come directly out and say that I'm not, but that is an extremely interesting point to consider.
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us for the seminar today. And I'll be posting up the recording as soon as it's all ready to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.